Great. No, great to have the opportunity to discuss this report, which is really impressive. I don't generally look forward to reading big reports from international organisations. I'm not sure what you lot think about it. You probably come to this type of thing so you don't have to read it, this type of report, so you can get the... And I'm a bit like that with another thing against the ILO, but it was actually benefiting me hugely in terms of contributing to my knowledge about the sector, about what's going on in social protection. And it's not just because of the coverage of data, it's the quality with which that's put together, the stories that are told about it, brilliantly illustrated in boxes, the ways in which the data is formulated, particularly at the regional level, which makes the trends a lot clearer. So it's a high quality piece of work, and I think it does set a new benchmark for the field, not just in social protection, but more broadly for this type of report. So I'm going to focus more on a research perspective. What type of contribution does this report make? What type of thinking does it draw on, and by the same token, what type of thinking does it not draw on, which could have been brought to bear here as well? So in terms of the type of contribution it makes, it's hugely informative in terms of its the sweep, the historical sweep, as Francesca's pointed out, of where things have moved to. This isn't on. Okay. Okay, so in terms of its coverage, descriptive coverage of what's actually out there on the ground, it's very impressive, and the analysis of that. There's also very interesting data in there about the sequencing that gets taken. How do governments put in place more comprehensive systems of social protection? What do they do first and thereafter, which is enabled again by the historical process. So that's very interesting. It can provide us a bit of a building block for moving away from what this report does really well, which is describe what's going on, to starting towards pushing us towards explaining how things got to that stage. I mean, this type of report can't do that job, but it gives us the platform for explaining that. And I'll come back to that in a second. We want to know, why is progress so uneven within some of these regions? Why have efforts to promote social protection been that much more effective in context A rather than context B? And I'll come back to that when we get down to the national level, because this is obviously a global report. That's the job it sets out to do, and it does it very well. And it's very interesting to approach it from a global level and look at what's going on in the north as well. The parlous state of welfare systems in high-income countries is something which is good to alert us to, I think. And some of the global inequalities in terms of, for example, the distribution of health workers between different regions comes out strongly in this report. So the global perspective brings a lot to the table, I think. But what about the national, where the critical sequencing trajectories take place and the key decisions get made, and where most of us are concerned with particular countries that we're interested in, and particularly with regard to Africa, which is showing up as blue on the map and clearly a long way behind other regions. So if this is the starting point, how can we build on this to take us forward to learn more about those types of things? And the temptation when presented with this type of data, even for someone as innumerous as me, is to try and work out, okay, well, are there any correlations between the level of social protection expenditure and other features of these countries? Why in sub-Saharan Africa have some countries done this and others haven't? Is it to do with the level of growth, which comes to the fiscal space issue? Is it to do with the type of democracy or level of democracy? So I asked a colleague of mine, Matt Tice at Manchester, to try and draw some broad correlations between the data presented in the ILO report on the vertical axis and 4 different variables. The first one, GDP per capita. So one thing to notice is just the level of variation within Africa, from something like 0.2 of GDP on social protection up to 12%. A huge variation within Africa, but very weak relationship to GDP, something like 10% of the variation could be explained just by that. If you look at structural transformation, the extent to which the economy is transformed into a more modern form, using Hausman and Hidalgo's ECI here, stronger for those of us who are fans of Polanyi, who think that capitalism just hasn't got bad enough yet in South Africa, that hasn't become sufficiently disembedded from social norms, which creates the political impulse for social protection. It's about twice as strong, the relationship here, but still not that persuasive. Those of you who are pro-democracy advocates, this is the worst news. Less than 1% of the variation can be explained by how democratic these countries are. So not all good things come together, clearly, on this level. And does it matter how high capacity the state has? Is it effective at delivering stuff? Not really. It's the next strongest after structural transformation, but still can only explain around 12%, and even then we're talking correlations, nothing about causality being implied here. So if that's not going to work, and how do we find out about the levels of social protection expenditure? And I think we need to move things on now to the country level of analysis and understand what it is, what are the variables that are shaping these different levels of political commitment to delivering social protection. And I think some of the work that Rachel's doing with SLRC, some of the work by PASGAR and University of Cape Town is focusing on this. And within my own research centre, ESID, I'm working with Tom Lavers of the ILO to put together a comparative programme which looks at things you can't capture in indices, the nature of the political settlement, the deals that get made between elites as to how to respond to various competing social demands, and the incentives that face ruling coalitions at different times. Think of Kenya and how social protection started to gain traction after the post-electoral violence created a need to rebuild relations between state and citizens around political legitimacy, then becomes embedded in constitutional reform, or the incentives for the government in Rwanda to respond at a very high level in social insurance, cash transfers, a range of issues, which is partly to do with a committed leader, but also the incentives for that minority regime, given the possibilities of return to violence, are very large to deliver on these fronts. So there's something about the political settlement and ruling coalition, but clearly what donors do in particular places, how far they promote this, what resources they give to it, how astute they are in advocating for social protection in relation to national discourses around who deserves what, for example, are coming out as significant in some of these studies I've referred to. So this is a global report. It tells us where we are. The next level of analysis, I think, needs to focus on those political factors a bit more thoroughly, and some of that work's ongoing. The final issue is what type of thinking informs this report, and it's really good to see a report which comes out and says what it's about. It's about social justice. That's how we should think about social protection. And I think that's there's too many ideological agendas get hidden and under the radar. ILO's coming out and saying this is the type of fairness that we want in the world, and there's a choice. It could have gone with well-being, freedom, utility, all these other things, good things in life. But I think they've gone exactly the right way. Social protection is best aligned with the types of political arrangements and redistribution of wealth associated with theories of social justice. But once you make that decision, it's a vision. It's one vision of social justice, and there are others. So if you think about, this is a sort of political spectrum, ideological spectrum of different theories of social. Everyone's got a theory of social justice. Ian Duncan Smith leads on social justice. It's not just a liberal left-wing ideal, and this is fed through different international organisations. So I think the ILO comes out with a very Rawlsian perspective on social justice, what it is, and we see this in the highlighting of the deprivatisation, the systemic focus on building systems rather than one-off programmes. I think it's very persuasive, and it takes us a lot further than what is, funnily enough, to your left as you look at that, the more minimalist targeted approach that we see. For example, if you've read the WDR, I'm betraying myself now, I do read these international reports, WDR 2014 on risk management, which to the extent to which it touches on social protection is a very thin approach to it. It gets concerned about the fiscal burden and creating dependence, these types of things, which are nowhere near as the muscular social democracy that we see with the ILO report. So I'm sort of two cheers for that, certainly, because if what the ILO proposes takes place, then we'll have greatly improved living standards. Human dignity would definitely be progressed. But it's not clear that the types of interventions that are being proposed would necessarily change the relational basis that keeps people poor, excluded, in positions of inequality in the first place. There's a choice made not to go towards a more radical theory of social justice, which does focus on the underlying power relations which keep people poor, and which would suggest a more radical policy agenda that wouldn't be just, of course, limited to social protection. It might feed into the transformative ideas of social protection that some people promote, but it would also encourage us to be perhaps a bit more critical about social protection and the extent to which politically, although the report claims there are positive political gains from social protection, the evidence could be quite a lot stronger on that from the report. And there's also evidence that social protection gets used as a political strategy as a palliative to forms of jobless growth in India and South Africa, for example, in ways that underpins patron-client forms of relationship rather than the fuller citizenship implied by the Rawlsian approach. So it's not clear to me as yet that if you take on the social justice lens but approach it from a different angle, you would come to the same policy solutions or even emphasis on social protection necessarily. But people will make their own choices about that. And I've been told not to choose to continue, so I'll miss the last point and save it for later. But yeah, well worth reading.
Okay, thanks very much, Sam. Francis, can we turn to you now?